Hello and welcome to the channel. I am your host, Jeff Freeman, and welcome to part 2 of my sit-down conversation with author James A McQuiston. As you know, James has written about 10 books on the subject of Oak Island with his theories on William Alexander. And that's where we pick up this part 2 as we are talking about a map that was published in 1624 by William Alexander. So I hope you'll enjoy this part 2, and be sure to look for part 3 coming out very soon.
Now, this is the map that William Alexander published in 1624.
Okay.
And he may have drawn this himself or had Inigo Jones draw it. I'll tell you why I think it might have been Inigo. But he said that he never remembered anything so fondly as America. Well, you can't remember a place if you've never been there.
All right.
King Charles, a couple of years later, said a place called Nova Scotia through the travels of William Alexander and the surveying of Nova Scotia. So he credited William Alexander with surveying it. In a museum in Nova Scotia at a little town called Liverpool, they have it on their wall. It's a history wall, and they say that William Alexander surveyed Nova Scotia. So he was not trained as a surveyor. Now, as one of his sons was, but he was a tremendous friend of Inigo Jones. Inigo Jones designed his home in London.
Oh, wow.
And that the whole there was a whole cabal, and these are the people in my book, the Masonic Conspiracy: Francis Bacon, Thomas Howard, who I'll talk about, and William Alexander all lived within a short walk of this place called Charing Cross, or Charing Cross. And even William Shakespeare, the only building that he ever purchased in London was just down the road. And they all were connected with Shakespeare. Some of them actually acted in his plays. Other ones financed him. So there's this big connection between Shakespeare, between Charing Cross, between all these people and the Freemasons. And it's explained thoroughly in the book, and it's extremely interesting. But if you go to number 4, which says it's the map snippet, you'll see I drew some arrows on there kind of roughly, but the one in the lower right, that says Rosenau. Well, that's where Liverpool is now. And that was one of the few landmarks Alexander put on his map. And that is where Liverpool is now, that has the
marks on the stones
that he surveyed it.
Mm-hmm.
There's a area called Lukesburg. There's an arrow pointing to that. Well, his first ship that made it there was called the St. Luke. So they created a little borough there. I believe that was actually pronounced Lukesborough, not Berg, like Edinburgh. But and that happens to cover the area where Liverpool is, pretty much. It's right up above it.
Right.
And a little arrow pointing down to Mahone Bay and another one pointing to La Have. And I'll show you why in a minute if you go to slide 5, which says Merligash. It's not just the name. Merligash isn't just the name, because how I even got onto that was a lady named Sylvie Delorme was working with Doug Kroll again, translating some French. And she noted that seemed like it was a Gaelic word. So he asked me to look into it. Well, because it was always said to be a Mi'kmaq word. I found as far back as the 9th century, Mir, M-I-R, meant a part of, and Lagash meant a league or an alliance. So it literally meant a part of an alliance.
Wow.
The reason why it's important is because it sticks out in a lot of different writing. First of all, in 1630, William Alexander chartered that land to a French leader there to try to make peace. And the actual charter is still in the charter book, still in the deed book. And it says that it extends from La Have, which you can see on the map, 14 leagues along the coast towards the northeast. Well, 14 leagues takes you way past Mahone Bay. So that means Mahone Bay was named Merligash. Secondly, I found a 1647 map that said that. I found a 1686 French map that actually has the word Merlegash written 3 times inside of
Wow.
Mahone Bay. Then I found a 1745 map and a 1748 or 49 map, which I believe was copied off the other one. But they actually pinpoint Merlegash to be at Chester, which Chester is like the closest town to
Right.
it's right across the bay there.
Right.
Well, what the story continues because other things happened where Merlegash is mentioned, but one of the bigger ones is that the very last Knight Baronet of Nova Scotia, his name was Thomas Temple, he was given that end of Nova Scotia, including specifically Merlegash, and he was a forefather of Franklin Roosevelt. He wasn't a direct relative, but they both went back to a direct relative. And he left his Merlegash deed to a son-in-law. I can't remember. I believe it was a son-in-law who was a direct ancestor of Franklin Roosevelt. And that deed still exists in Harvard University Library or archive. And Franklin Roosevelt went to Harvard for school. So it absolutely ties the Knights of Nova Scotia to the Oak Island area and to Roosevelt. And that's only a little bit of the link to the Knights of
And we
Nova.
know that Roosevelt was actually part of one of the search teams
Yeah.
on Oak Island, many years ago. So, wow.
So there's so many connections. Literally, there are hundreds of little connections like that when you add it all up and you look at it, you say this just can't all be coincidence, because there's too many things going on here. But I'll just note a couple other things on that map. I'm going to enlarge it on my own screen here. I think I am, because my eyes are too bad. So you can see up there, you can see where Oak Island is, and then you can see the name Merlegash. Well, the charter says it extended from La Have, which is marked there, all the way up to the other side of Mahone Bay. But the last 2 maps actually said it was Chester. And then the Liverpool Museum has the article about Alexander surveying. King Charles said that he surveyed. Alexander said he never remembered anything so fondly as America. And so all of that is history that nobody really ever put together before. And I just got it in pieces, actually, over several books. But when you see something, I don't know if I have a knack for it or not. I'm not trying to say that I do. But when you see something, you go, oh my gosh, that's the missing link to the missing puzzle piece to that story, and you just start building it and building it. It's all real. I didn't make a single thing that's up on there up. That's all real stuff.
Right.
And so that's why sometimes it becomes frustrating with the mainstreamers, because they don't want to, at least some of them don't want to look at the real stuff. They don't want to see the document that says that Franklin Roosevelt's forefather owned Merlegash, which was Mahone Bay, which is where Oak Island is, et cetera, even though it's right there. So,
Okay. So the next one, this is your book, Oak Island and New Ross here.
yeah, that was like the 8th or 9th book, but that was the one that Harmon Legg and Tim and Alessandra and Steve Guptill helped me with. And what's interesting about this painting was done in 1634, and it was done by a man who was noted for detail. It shows King Charles handing a renewal of the charter for Nova Scotia to Sir William Alexander. Well, that's only the second image of Sir William Alexander that exists anywhere. And that had to be searched for and dug out of a collector's vault to be shown here. And the painting itself was much bigger, and all the way around the sides it had clues, and we dug into all the clues of it.
Oh, wow. I'd love to see that.
That's all in that particular book right there. But anyway, just the point that it's the only other image of him in history, that anybody knows of. And it's the first time that we noticed that he has red hair, which makes sense because he was a Scotsman. But, the black and white, he had white or black hair, but in this, he actually has red hair. So that's kind of neat. But the painting, I never was able to produce the painting 100% because they did not want it to be out on the internet as a full resolution. But they said you can use all the snippets you want. And I sent everything back to them, said, this is going to be here, this is going to be there. And fine with this, fine with that. So I actually sent them a signed copy of that book to put on an easel next to the painting.
Awesome. That's really cool.
Yeah. And then I did a few more books, and then I got to the Oak Island Masonic Conspiracy, which I was telling you about. And that's your next slide there. Yes.
Yep.
And I simplified the cover a little bit because I really wanted to hone down to the Masonic angle. And in this book, I'm going to tell you this little story right now. And this is one of the key parts of the book. But in 1655, it was right when the Protestant Reformation was starting. Well, Mary Queen of Scots was Catholic, and she wasn't about to give up her Catholic faith.
All right.
So she was walking a tightrope. Some of the nobles were still Catholic, some of them were still Protestant. She was trying to keep the peace in her kingdom. And so the Protestants had overtaken the Scottish Parliament. And in England and in other countries, Freemasons, or not Freemasons yet, Masons, their secret meetings were outlawed. And the use of a deacon, which was not a religious position, it was a managerial position, it still was outlawed. And so, but those countries, most of them had turned Protestant, at least England had, and somehow they got through with it. But when it happened in Scotland, the date was June 10th, 1555. And again, this isn't something I'm making up. There's an actual documents to verify it. This act was passed because they were making dangerous leagues and alliances. That made me start thinking about Mirligash. Maybe when it said part of the alliance, it had nothing to do with William Alexander and his French friend that he sold it to. Maybe it had to do with everybody knew that Mirligash was the secret place where this alliance of all these Freemasons and ex-Templar families were all concentrating their effort.
Right.
Oak Island. And but anyway, so things started falling apart, and within 9 months, she reinstated the Freemasons. And so, had she not done that, there could have. She reinstated the stonemasons to have private meetings, secret meetings. Had she never done that, there never could have been the Freemasons, because the Freemasons essentially took over the stonemason lodges, particularly starting with Edinburgh Lodge number 1, which I talk a lot about that in this book, who built it originally and all that. So if she hadn't resurrected the power of the trade guilds and their deacons or overseers to carry their business on in secret, with self-directed lodges, there could have never been Freemasonry. And it wasn't just the stonemasons. That's one thing that gets missed a little bit, because there's so much mysticism about the Freemasons. But it was with the carpenters, who were called Wrights at the time. They met in secret. Leather workers, all these people, because they wanted to keep their trade secrets a secret, so that other people that weren't a member, weren't a paying member or whatever,
Right.
Like they call them scabs, for a union calls them scab. Well, these were essentially, and when they first got together, it was the Wrights and the Masons that started meeting at Mary's Chapel in Edinburgh. And then they let in a whole bunch of other guilds. They called them guilds back then. So it's the focus has been on the Freemasons, but it was all these guilds that were being outlawed to have secret meetings. She reinstated all that. 7 years later, she appropriated all the final possessions and properties of the Templars in Scotland. They were being handled by a Knight of Malta named James Sandilands, who was often referred to as the Grand Master of the Templars and the Knights of Malta. And even Elias Ashmole, who was one of the main early Masonic historians, stated that he was the last representative of the Templars in Scotland. Well, she made a deal with him to turn all of this over to kind of end that era. And then he would get a certain amount of land, and he would become, he'd get this title, Lord Torpichen.
Okay.
And so there was a lot of back and forth on it, but that happened in 1563. So it was essentially the very end of Templarism in Scotland. And there were several men involved in the process. And at least 4 of them, their son, grandson, or nephew became a Knight of Nova Scotia. And later on, they became Freemasons. So this is an absolute connection of these families and fathers and sons from Templarism to the Knights of Nova Scotia to Freemasonry. And there's never been this specific of connection. You know, you always hear, well, I think there's some legend about Templars and Freemasons. Well, it's not a legend anymore because I have all the documents and all the quotes and all of that. So basically, during the reign of Mary Queen of Scots, the Templarism ended in Scotland, and Freemasonry got a kickstart with her. They have secret meetings. So I learned this separate from my Mary Queen of Scots cipher code, but when I learned this, I thought, wow, that's pretty cool, because not only was she that intimately involved in these organizations, but now you can use her code to decipher the 90-foot stone if you are so inclined. When I did,
if we could find it.
Yeah. Well, and I went by the Kempton Code and what was translated by Edward Snow.
And let me ask you, do you feel that that's, I mean, with all the research you've done, do you feel that that is a good, translation of what was on the stone? Do you believe it's real?
Well, the reason why I would put a lot of faith in it, a couple of reasons, is that Doug did a lot of research on who this original translator would have been at Dalhousie. And actually a language teacher. And then
I remember that.
And said that he got it from an old Irish teacher from Dalhousie. And I can't remember his name right now. He was not, the man who translated was not Irish, but he was Huguenot, and the Huguenots had come over with the Scotch Irish. So the Scotch Irish were called the Irish. So that's probably why he was referred to as an Irish school teacher, but his last name wasn't Irish at all. He was like a Swedish Huguenot. But anyway, so Kempton didn't really have a reason to lie because of the fact that he graduated from Acadia University, which is still one of the top universities in Nova Scotia, and he was a reverend. He was a minister. So when I've always looked at it this way, that if people lie during their lifetime, they're going to get found out, and they're going to be, there's going to be scandal in the paper that, oh, you're not going to believe what old man Kempton said, and whatever, And so if somebody writes that they heard about it, yeah, that's hearsay. But if somebody has some kind of credibility already and makes a statement, you kind of got to at least put some stock in it.
Yeah.
And he transferred it to Edward Snow, who put it in the book. So I could see where maybe some symbols were copied oddly or missed, or if you notice the very first one looks like it's duplicated with a stroke through it for the second one. And I think that may have been a mistake by the carver or by the translator, that he didn't realize that he was duplicating it and just put a line through it. But so
are you talking about the one that looks like an eye with the
this one is it's a
eye?
But it has a like a slash mark through it, as if it's no good. I should have had Kempton's translation up here too. But anyway, the If you use the Mary Queen of Scots cipher, it's symbol for word, not letter for word, which everybody's been trying to translate it letter for word. But through the majority of human history, symbols have been the means of communication, from the hieroglyphics to cuneiform writing. Even today, we have international signs and we have emojis on our phone. So we've only known how to write letters for so long, but we've known how to make symbols for 33,000 years or something
Right.
on cave walls. So a lot of her code translated specifically a symbol for a word or the name of a person, which made it a whole lot quicker and a much longer story in the end.
And here is a picture of some of those, supposedly the symbols that are on the stone. Is this the one you were talking about?
Yes, and what she had on her code sheet, she had things called nulls, which she had an extra E in it. We would call them, we would write it without the E, but they were symbols that meant absolutely nothing, but she'd stick them in the code to confuse people. And
Okay.
on about 10 of her sheets, first of all, I have to say that I have the world's largest collection of her digitized
Really?
cipher sheets. I have 104 of them. It took me 3 months to find them and 2 months to understand them. I paid the United Kingdom's National Archives to look for them and then to scan them for me. I scanned anything that has any kind of code on it whatsoever. So there were 104 sheets in the end. And so on several of the sheets, she had this X looking item as her number one null listed. So I counted that as a null on the code. The very first line literally reads, "Oh God, send angels." The downward arrow is angels. The upward triangle is send. The downward triangle is the word "oh," not "oh" like "oh, where did I put my keys," but "oh God, help me," or "oh Canada." It's a supplication. And the second symbol is odd because she had, even though she died for her religion, she had no code for Jesus or God. Nowhere on her code sheets, 104 code sheets. But she did have intelligence on there, once spelled with a lowercase, with one symbol, and spelled with an uppercase I, and that was that circle with the line through it. So I thought, well, perhaps that's because she's already under the gun for her religion. Maybe that's her code for God, supreme intelligence, whatever you want to say. So if that would read, "Oh God, send angels." And so the two lines down in the bottom corner are of interest because that's where they talk about, where it mentions Thomas Howard. He's the plus sign. And on the bottom line, the cross is support, which would make sense, like a cross supporting a man. Support Thomas Howard, God, Master Mason, because that 3-dot triangle is the Master Mason. And then this Roman numeral 2 is son Henry. So he says, support Thomas Howard, God, Master Mason, and his son Henry Howard. And above it, they're both mentioned again. Well, if you go to the third line down on the left, there's what looks like the cross of Lorraine. It's the straight line with two.
Yeah, that's the one I was talking about earlier.
Yeah. Okay. And originally, I thought that somewhere I got the idea that meant treasure. I don't know how I got that. So when I went up and gave my presentation on this in 2021, I believe it was, I didn't, I translated that as treasure. But in looking at it further and looking at her sheets further, it stood for another gentleman. His name was William Douglas, and he was the High Treasurer of Scotland. Well, his namesake and cousin, who he raised in his own household, he was Alstraken's partner in the robbery. So now I'm like, oh my gosh, I got the Alstraken robbery connected with a 90-foot stone and the Douglas family. And The reason why Thomas Howard is so significant, two reasons. One is he's on William Alexander's 1624 map. His title's on there. And his grandfather had Mary Queen of Scots cipher sheets, the same ones that I own digital copies of now, hidden under his floor tile. And when they were found, he got his head lopped off. So her cipher codes were already in the family of Thomas Howard. And now Thomas Howard's name is found on the 90-foot stone using the cipher codes. So again, all these connects, they're just crazy. And if it's not that story, I haven't heard a better one. That's all I say. It's I've spent 8 years on this. I've written 10 books. I've corresponded with the Society of Antiquaries of Scotland, with the Museums of Scotland, the National Archives of Scotland, National Archives of the UK, the British Museums helped me. I went to the College of Geographic Sciences with Doug up in Nova Scotia. The archives, Nova Scotia Archives with Doug, where we dug out a few things, no pun intended. And I've worked with the Oak Island people. I've worked with other Oak Island theorists, have long conversations with them, and with a lot of other historians. So I wouldn't want anybody to look at this and say, this is just Jim's interpretation of it all in these books. They have to look at it, read the book, and see where my sources were, because the secret's in the source.
Right.
Not in my writing. It's in that source. Right. You want to look it up. In most cases, I give the source if I can. It's not too complex, but it's there. So it's there for people if they want to read it.
Well, I hope you have enjoyed this part 2 of my sit-down conversation with James A. McQuiston. Be sure to check out part 3, and also check out James's latest book, Oak Island, A Masonic Conspiracy, which is available on Amazon now. Thanks again for watching or listening, and have a great evening.